This segment of the Chopin podcast is brought to you by the Chopin Foundation of the United States, dedicated to promoting young American pianists and making Chopin's music accessible to all. I've got a little anecdote for you. I recently attended the final round of a piano competition that included performances of the usual warhorse Russian concertos, but also a performance of Chopin's E minor concerto. Now, during intermission, I was partaking in one of my favorite pastimes of eavesdropping on my fellow concertgoers when I heard a woman say something to the effect of, "The Chopin concertos are nice background music, but I really came to hear Rachmaninoff." This is nothing new. There's long been a stigma attached to Chopin's two piano concertos as being formally confused or poorly orchestrated showpieces that lack the depth of some of his more serious solo compositions. But for Cambridge University professor of music John Rink, it's high time we drop these tired stereotypes about the Chopin concertos. Rink has been one of the leading Chopin scholars in the world for decades and will sit on the jury of the 2025 International Chopin Competition in Warsaw. He literally wrote the book on Chopin's concertos, and it was my privilege to meet him on a video call in which he provided historical context for their composition and defended their merits as strikingly original contributions to the concerto genre.
I regard the two concertos of Chopin as outstanding masterpieces, no questions asked. They were extremely important in his own compositional development and in his performance career, and I think they're very important in terms of the contribution that Chopin makes to the genre more generally. We have to remember, first of all, that Chopin set out to be a composer-pianist, if you like, and he left Warsaw in the autumn of 1830 with several orchestral pieces in his repertoire. He'd composed the Lachida Rem Variations, which publishes Opus 2, the Fantasy unpublished airs, Opus 13, and the Rondo Alekoviak, Opus 14, all performed in Vienna in August 1829 when he visited and had a rapturous success. He returned to Warsaw and set to work on the F minor concerto with a view to expanding his repertoire for an eventual career as a composer-pianist. And the E minor followed shortly after. So these two concertos emerged during a very short period of time in Chopin's life, but after he'd composed those other three pieces with orchestra, with only one to follow later on. And I regard the F minor concerto, which was composed first, the E minor to follow, although the publication order was switched. I regard the F minor as really, truly, astonishingly original. I think it's the more original of the two in many ways. There are certain oddities that take it outside the sort of norm, so the lack of repeat of the first theme and the first movement and so forth. But there's just such freshness in the ideas with a very personal stamp on the ornamentation. So, for example, the main theme is somewhat more subdued than you might get in many cases. You don't have a virtuoso flash for its own sake. It's tied into an expressive argument. Now, Chopin used the E minor concerto as a kind of warhorse in his early career. He's known to have performed the F minor, the second movement, in fact, only once after arriving in Paris, whereas the E minor concerto was the kind of the go-to piece for him. It was featured at his Paris debut concert in February 1832, and he performed it on a number of occasions thereafter, with orchestra, in one case just one movement and so forth, up until 1838, which is the last known performance with orchestra in his career. So it was a kind of front foot forward piece for him. It really made his reputation. So we cannot deny the importance of it. It was less favorably received by some critics than the F minor, which was immediately recognized as original, but nevertheless well regarded over time. One important thing to remember is that early on, many of the criticisms that others had leveled at these pieces were never articulated by critics. So later writers say that the form, Chopin's formal sense, particularly in the E minor concerto first movement, his sense of form is very weak. Donald Francis Tovey called the tonal plan, the harmonic plan, suicidal. Frankly, this is ridiculous. Nobody ever complained about this. For 50-some years after the time the piece was written. Equally, the orchestration was never complained about. In fact, it was praised by some early critics. Later ones, towards the end of the 19th century, started to find it inadequate. But of course, expectations had changed, performance practice had changed. So what I tried to do in my book on the concertos, which I published in 1997, was to reevaluate them more in the terms of relevance at the time they were written. And we find that actually Chopin's suicidal plan works extremely well in its particular way. There's a kind of expressive logic that comes out of what he does. So what we have to do is abandon models that aren't appropriate and start hearing the music more in terms of what it's telling us. The same with the orchestration. There are absolutely marvelous features to the orchestration. So duets with the bassoon, for example, in the E minor concerto, the ending of the second movement, this gorgeous flute ascent, which you really need. I mean, if you're playing this as a solo, which was one possibility, Chopin did perform this music as a solo and needed to because of the uncertainty surrounding the orchestral forces at his disposal. To perform it without that flute, you miss something. In short, you need the orchestra. But I would like to say that I think you need the orchestra for which a piece is suited, not the later 19th century, 20th century mammoth symphony orchestra that would be more appropriate, say, to Brahms or later composers. So it's a matter of rehearing, reevaluating, and reappreciating the music.
It's interesting to compare Chopin's concertos to Brahms because among the other romantic composers of the 19th century, Brahms was the one who wrote a grand concerto with a massive tutti, in the classical style. And those are features of Chopin's works, which Schumann and Liszt, deviate from and take in a new direction. And of course, will inspire many of the late romantic concertos that are so part of the repertoire today. But I'm just thinking about that because Brahms was really using his first concerto as one of his many practice attempts at an eventual symphony. Chopin does the opposite. I mean, he writes whatever he wrote for orchestra was early in the career. It seems to be part of this debut phenomenon. Like, I need to get on stage with and prove who I am. The orchestra plays the tutti. I come in the E minor with this grand, forte. But then once he established himself, perhaps, I'm speculating, I'd love for you to sort of comment on this, he realized, or maybe always knew, his true calling was as a composer of piano music. He also died young. Maybe he would have returned to these things. We know the cello sonata comes late. Could you comment on that trajectory of like starting the career with some orchestral piano and orchestra works and then moving to an almost purely, piano-only composer?
We have to remember that early on, Chopin did have in mind a career as a composer pianist. Now, these were pianists who would tour the European capitals or wherever, putting on concerts and earning income. So you had to perform music that was going to appeal, that would attract audiences, and so forth. And it was expected that you would have in your arsenal and your repertoire pieces with orchestra, which could also be adapted for solo or chamber performance based on what was available in any given place. What we seem to find in Chopin's case is in the mid-1830s, a change in optic, change in identity, if you like, from composer, pianist, more towards composer, who of course was also, and always would be, first and foremost, a pianist. But it's no longer the case of composing for the season. It's more a case of composing for posterity, something like that. And I think there's a significant change of attitude in the mid-1830s in Chopin's case, when he became somewhat disenchanted with a kind of, if you like, ephemerality of the music that was expected of the composer pianist, and was more attracted perhaps to a kind of deeper profundity. Now, whether he would have gone back to pieces of orchestra or not, I couldn't begin to say. But my colleague Jim Sampson has a beautiful line in a study of Chopin's music in the brilliant style. And the brilliant style is a term that's often misunderstood. People interpret it as meaning sort of virtuoso and bravura. But in fact, it's a particular kind of style which alternates between sentimental, poetic, thematic utterance and display in this kind of combination, leading usually to an exciting finish. What Jim Sampson says is that in his later music, Chopin transcended the brilliant style. He transcended it, but remembered it. And we find the absolute essence of the brilliant style, as I've just described it, for example, in the final movement of Chopin's B minor Sonata Opus 58. That absolute essence is there, and Chopin uses that to very great expressive effect in a way that goes well beyond what he achieved as a younger composer, but nevertheless is tied to it in certain key respects.
You talked about the need for the right kind of orchestra. And, the romantic concerto really goes in a different direction, a different aesthetic. Are there specific period performances of this work that you find convincing, or have you heard performances, or what are your tastes with respect to listening to Chopin piano concertos?
Well, I have two examples in mind of particularly effective performances of the concertos. There's a set of recordings produced by the Chopin Institute in Warsaw with the orchestra of the 18th century under Franz Bruggen. And these recordings include all of the works with orchestra. They're absolutely marvelous. They capture a kind of lighter orchestral sound and a very sparkling, juvenescent piano sound using period instruments, in fact. So I would very much recommend those to people, and they're really marvelous. The most exciting performance I've ever witnessed of the concertos was Kevin Kenner playing with a quintet. And he achieved a kind of rapport and dialogue. There was a unity there, which is much harder to achieve with a full orchestra. And of course, we have to remember that Chopin performed the E minor concerto with a string ensemble at his first debut concert in Paris. So I think that kind of more intimate approach is highly appropriate.
I remember growing up being reminded, actually, his E minor concerto is the second concerto, but never knowing why. Why was it published first? There's something about the aesthetic of the piece. Obviously, the entrance is so different. It's longer. It's more fleshed out. But yeah, what do you think is the explanation for that decision on his part?
I think the E minor concerto, in some respects, is a more substantial piece. It seems to be the piece that he chose for his debut concert on the 25th of February, 1832. There's some ambiguity about that. It's not absolutely precise, but the wording of the program, which was discovered relatively recently, one copy of it, suggests that it is likely to be the E minor. I think because it was more substantial, it was the piece that he played there, it was how he became known to the Paris public. I think all of that works in favor of it being the first of the two to be published. But we have to remember also that it is closer to the tradition in certain ways. It's like Hummel's A minor concerto on the one hand, but it's also like Kalkbrenner's D minor. If you listen to the D minor Opus 61, the opening theme of the Kalkbrenner is a very close cousin to the theme of Chopin's Opus 11. What is absolutely different is that after Kalkbrenner gets through the business of playing the theme, you go straight into a kind of virtuoso episode like the horse is bolted. Whereas in Chopin's case, the episode, which normally is sometimes called a spiel episode, a playing episode, this begins piano and it builds gradually. So Chopin's aesthetic is totally different, but because the piece is somewhat closer to its models, it may also have been a reason for him to choose it as his the first to be published, because it was possibly more familiar to the public.
Do you think there's a sort of a case to be made for the sort of operatic qualities in the concertos? I mean, there is a recit in the middle of the F minor, but just in general, do you sort of regard them as kind of operatic works, but for orchestra and instead of singers, sort of piano?
I think that opera is hugely present in both concertos, particularly in the two middle movements, the slow movements. The ornamentation in Opus 21 slow movement is straight out of the opera house in certain ways, although always, as in the case of Chopin, always adapted for piano. You couldn't possibly sing it. It's conceived for, it's idiomatic for the piano, but it's nevertheless directly tied to opera. That applies also to the E minor concerto Romance, the second movement. To call them operatic works, I think goes perhaps too far, but so much of the thematic writing is vocally inspired, which of course relates to opera, but I think it's just a more general kind of thing, a particular lyrical quality, a cantilena, which we find also in, say, the nocturnes par excellence. So yes, absolutely operatic qualities, but the larger governing category is probably vocal music. Chopin was continually telling his students, sing, 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 breathe, and so forth, and even breathe with the wrist. So there was a kind of physical emulation of the singer, which is right at the heart of the Chopin aesthetic.
Just finally, do you have any favorite moments, passages that you especially look forward to, or that give you goosebumps or bring you to tears? Maybe one from each concerto, if you have any off the top of your head.
I think in the case of the E minor concerto, the passage that always kills me is when the second theme comes back in G major. And what Chopin does is have a very beautiful return of it, with somewhat different ornamentation, but then we launch into what amounts to a recitative. There's this outpouring of emotion. And it reaches a moment of crisis as Chopin builds away from G major towards the returning tonic E minor. It's absolutely gorgeous, this passion, which is also like a kind of recitative passage in the first movement of the F minor. Chopin's second theme doesn't end the way you expect. There's a deflected, deceptive cadence, and then you launch into another recitative, which I liken to the recitative in Bach's Chromatic Fantasy. I've written about this. The kind of opposition between voice and accompaniment, as it were, recitativo accompagnato. So those two movements in each concerto are absolutely killers for me, but there's so many others. The opening of, and particularly the return of the opening in the slow movement of the F minor, again, absolutely ravishing, and played in an especially ravishing way by Tomasz Ritter in his 2018 prize-winning performance in the competition on period instruments in Warsaw. Really sensational playing.
if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to my Patreon, where paying members have access to bonus scenes from my interviews with Garrick Ohlsson and other guests throughout the series, and where you'll also get a discount on the new line of Chopin podcast merch.